It is my great pleasure now to introduce Maddy, Chief Executive of NAVCA, who is going to be giving us a keynote lecture to close the session. And depending on how long she speaks, if it is less than the time we said 30 minutes, we may have opportunities for questions, but I can't guarantee a question and answers at the very end. Maddy, over to you.
Thanks, Fadile. I put my camera on. I don't know if you can see me. I'm not sure what the room can see. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can hear you.
Perfect.
Go ahead.
Thank you for the introduction. Thank you for the opportunity to speak this afternoon. As you say, I'm conscious it's the end of the day. I suspect that everyone's brains are rather tired and fried. But I also hope you've had a great day with the lectures and the workshops and so on. So as Fadile said, I'm Maddy Desforges. I'm Chief Executive at NAVCA. So we're the umbrella body for local infrastructure organisations across England. We've got 181 members. That network works with supports around 164,000 organisations across England, and are really key, I think, to thriving communities. So we're all about resilient, connected, inclusive communities, a thriving VCS, and the importance of infrastructure as intermediaries with communities and statutory agencies, statutory bodies, really supporting strong social action, justice, active citizenships, and so on. So that's where I was coming from the point of view of collaboration. And it's probably worth pausing to just mention the full function of infrastructure. So many of you will be familiar with local infrastructure organisations. You'll know that they have key roles around leadership and advocacy for the local VCS, for communities. Sorry, my phone's just gone at the wrong time. Around volunteering and creating good conditions for volunteering. Around practical support and capacity building for communities. But crucially also, one of those four functions is collaborations and partnerships, which feels really relevant to the theme of today's speeches and workshops and so on, thinking about collaboration. So I was thinking about this talk, what I was going to say, and thinking about what the provocation might be around collaborations. And I've been thinking quite a lot in the last few weeks about the decade of renewal that we're talking about needing for the country, around a broken society in many ways, and the role of the voluntary sector to work with government and others around that decade of renewal that we need. And feeling very conscious that the voluntary sector has got a really pivotal role in that. And whatever bits of government policy you look at or touch, there's a role for the voluntary sector, perhaps not in nuclear power, but around health, around housing, around employment, the economy, skills, education. The voluntary sector is front and centre in what we bring to those conversations and debates. So we're thinking about how we as a sector take that moment, take that opportunity and really contribute to that renewal that is needed. But I'm also conscious the voluntary sector is about hope and joy and fun. And I have a concern that the more we get into supporting the government and working on renewal, that we might lose that. So I suppose my provocation was thinking about how can the voluntary sector work in collaboration to achieve that decade of renewal, to really see system change, to see that renewal, but also to not lose sight of what I think one of its key functions are around the joy and the fun and the optimisation of how we live our lives and people taking action, driving social action on the things that matter for them. So if that's the provocation, that's very much about how do we do that? How does the voluntary sector work in collaboration? I think it's worth, before we dive into that, just pausing for a moment on why that matters. And there's lots of work at the moment around those key aspects of our country which need reform, which need to change, around how people access health, how people stay healthy, how we build the economy, how we make sure people have got the skills they need to live really productive lives, how we make sure that everybody has got somewhere warm and safe and dry to live. So that reform is underway, that needs to happen. But in doing that, I think it's worth recognising that across the piece, we're facing, I think, fairly unprecedented reform in the public sector structures that underpin it. So looking at local authority reform and the shift to move away from district councils to unitary authorities, to create new authorities, to merge, to come together. thinking about health and the shift to communities, the shift to prevention, but also at how we are once again transforming the health landscape and thinking about 50% cuts to integrated care systems and how they will work through. And those things create opportunities and threats for civil society, for the voluntary sector, in terms of resetting relationships and working really well with local governments as power is perhaps devolved from Westminster to those strategic authorities, to unitary authorities. But the shifts in health and local government also create threats around recognition of the importance of the voluntary sector, how we engage really effectively, whether some of those statutory bodies will be very focused on their internal systems and mechanisms, as well as how they drive change. So that reform to the public sector is an important context. But we're also seeing a shrinking civil space that's been happening for a little while around how people function, interrelate, how we really draw on civil society. And of course, we've got huge challenges around EEDI and around climate change that we're focused on, that we all need to work together to really drive change on. And unless we can see change in those spaces, then some of the other picture around just England fades away a little bit. So there's a key role for the voluntary sector to support the state, to work with the state on those changes that need to drive through, but also to enhance the state and what it's doing. And I think I would see very much the role I would want the voluntary sector to play would be to supplement, to build on, to make better what's the basic provision that the state makes. But also the role of the voluntary sector, going back to that provocation, is around supporting people to do the stuff that matters to them, to bring the joy, to bring the fun, to bring the excitement to life, to make people and communities resilient, thriving places where everyone can live their best life. So understandably, the VCS has got a key role in all of that. But there's something about now, I think, because of those changes, the changes to local authorities and local government, the changes to health, the real pressing need for change on EEDI, for change on how we reduce our carbon emissions, how we reduce and mitigate the worst impacts of climate change, that now collaboration to me matters more than ever, and that we've got to do something together on that to really drive change. There's a saying, if you want to go fast, go on your own, go solo. If you want to go far, go together. I think I'm definitely in that let's go far and let's go together space, recognising I think it will take us a little bit longer to do that, but we'll ultimately get to a better place and we'll get further. So that's why we want to do it and why it matters. There's something about why the voluntary sector and why working in collaboration with the voluntary sector is really important. And there's 5 things I think I'd pull out in that. And I know that you all know this, but I think it's worth reiterating and perhaps just reflecting on how we make the best use of these aspects of the voluntary sector. So the first, I think, is around knowledge and insights. And the voluntary sector works closely, it's with, it's in, it's by and for communities. And it's got a really deep knowledge and insights into communities. And we see that time and time again, where people locally, they're experts in their own community, they know what's going on. And if we can listen to them in a really effective way, we'll get to a better place. And going back to things like the Grenfell tragedy, people in the tower blocks knew where the risks were. They had insights into how that could be improved. If we look at communities now and think about transport or housing or jobs, people know what they need and what's best for that community. And there's something about perhaps a disconnect in collaboration between recognising the perhaps more informal, the qualitative aspects of that knowledge and insights against perhaps more economic quantitative data, which the public sector might be expecting to see to make decisions. There's something around trust and relationships. So the voluntary sector has been around for a long time. Many of our members are coming up to 100 years of being in existence. They were created in the interwar period, interestingly, when conditions perhaps weren't that different now in terms of a need for massive social support and social change. And the relationships between the voluntary sector and communities are trusted, they're strong. And if we can build on those trust and relationships, we can perhaps get access and stronger voice to communities to help to bring some of the knowledge and insights to the fore. The third thing I point to around the benefits of working with the voluntary sector is around problem solving. And there are very few things that are more creative than people in communities who have a purposeful need to solve a problem. They can get round different silos, different policy agendas, think about actually what really matters and how can we work together to solve this problem. And if you think about how that flows through into my fourth one around co-design, if we can engage communities really effectively in co-design, we'll come up with better services, which don't just meet the needs of a small or narrow policy agenda, but co-design which really gets to the heart of what a community wants and needs. The fifth thing I'd point to around what the voluntary sector brings is around delivery. And sometimes people in public sector jobs can jump straight into the voluntary sector as a provider of services. We can do it well, we can do it effectively, we can do it cost effectively. I think for me that definitely is the fifth on that list of why work with the voluntary sector. It's about the knowledge, it's about the trust, it's the problem solving and the co-design, which I think are where the strengths really come in terms of collaboration and working closely. So by working in collaboration, we can really understand different perspectives and different communities, different people's needs. We can bring together a wider set of skills and draw on a set of skills to work in that space around what communities need. But there's something about the power and access in collaboration. And we often see power as being in the hands of people at the top of a hierarchy, decision makers, people who hold funds. There's also power in communities to be levered in. I think that the Me Too campaign, the Black Lives Matter movement, have done a lot to show the power of communities and thinking about collaboration, thinking about the power and access to that power in all directions, not just where we might immediately jump to, is really important. So collaboration for me really is about connections and influence and thinking about how we can bring together different people from different places to work together to agree what the problems are we want to solve and then think about what the way forward is on that. So if the why on collaboration to me is pretty clear, hopefully my phone's going again, doesn't normally go. If the why is pretty clear, then how? How do we work in collaboration? I think if it was easy, we'd all be doing it already. We wouldn't need to talk about it and spend a day coming together in a conference, talk about how to collaborate more effectively. And I think we need to give ourselves a bit of a break sometimes around collaboration, that it is difficult, that we need to collaborate with the right people at the right time in the right way. And it requires a number of things, I think, to collaborate well. I think it requires humility. So it requires a desire to work with others, a desire to practice other people's skills, to understand their experiences, but to come without ego, without agenda, to come with humility, I think, at its absolute core. I think it requires curiosity. So to be open to see a problem from a different perspective, to be inquisitive, to think about, well, what are they doing and why are they doing it that way? And what's the impact of that? And what can I learn from that? And that inherent curiosity we often see in children. And if we can go back to that, again, leaving egos at the door and just thinking really differently about what we're seeing and what it means, I think that goes a long way towards collaboration. I think it requires understanding about what are the set of circumstances and the backgrounds and the organisational structure that makes someone behave in the way they are. How can we understand what someone's needs are, what they're aiming to achieve, what their goal is and how it might align with our goal? And so I think seeking that understanding, really spending time to understand in depth is really important. I think it requires flexibility. It requires give and take. It's not my outcome at all cost, but how can we work together to achieve the best outcome for everybody here, for communities, for people? And that flexibility is difficult because the longer we go on, we get entrenched into ways of working or perhaps what our goal is and seek to achieve that at cost to others. It requires common goals. So it requires, again, leaving individual or organisational aims at the door and thinking about what's the cumulative impact of what we can do. What's not just my specific, perhaps quite narrow policy agenda, but what's the broader point we want to achieve and how can we align that so we all get to where we want to get to? I think most importantly, I think this is often the stumbling block, is it requires time and capacity to collaborate. It requires time and capacity to invest in relationships and understanding and being inquisitive and curious. And I find that sometimes the conversations that we have, the way that we work, the urgency that we have, It's the time and capacity to spend building those relationships and working with others can be the thing which is hard to find. We're all really pressed in our work, in our jobs, in what we're trying to achieve. I sometimes think if we could perhaps give greater credibility and credence and value to time and capacity to spend together, as we are today, I think that's really helpful and important for collaboration. So I was thinking then about, well, that sounds a bit difficult. Can we point to places where it's worked well? And can we take heart from that? And can we take hope from that around how does collaboration work well within the voluntary sector, but also between the voluntary sector and public sectors? How does it work across sectors? How does it work in different parts of system hierarchy? Going back to that PowerPoint about how we can engage differently and connect differently with leaders at different levels, with organisation at different levels, and think about those reasons and ways of collaborating across the piece. And I was thinking about a couple of examples, one local and one national, where it's happened really well. And I think that one of the reasons that it works well in both these examples is because of those things around humility and inquisitiveness and understanding. But perhaps most importantly, time and spending time together to understand what's going on. And the first thing I wanted to talk about was a project called Spring that I know about, which is about supporting refugees and asylum seekers in Sheffield. And there were multiple organisations working with the same cohort of refugees and asylum seekers, people new into the country, new into Sheffield, who were all doing great stuff. They were giving legal advice and support. They were finding houses and accommodation for people. They were helping with English language tuition. They were helping with education and schools. They were helping people feel more connected and embedded into the place through volunteering. They were running an initial welcome drop-in for people coming in, looking at how that was happening. But it was ad hoc. It was difficult to navigate. For a very vulnerable group of people, they were having to find different front doors to go through, having to work out where to be at what time, having to think about how they might move between different organisations. And those groups were a little bit in competition. They were working with the same people, but they weren't really joined up. They weren't looking at how they could make the best use of what they were doing. They were a bit concerned about overlap and duplication. Actually, you're stepping into my territory. But over a year, they came together and took some funding to do that, took some lottery funding to give them the capacity of, rather than being head down, I've got to meet these people, I've got to run my drop-in centre, I've got to run my legal advice, I've got to run my income generation, I've not got time to speak to anybody else. So it took some funding to give a bit of space for that. And they came together and looked at how they could work together and what the benefits might be and what the impact might be. And by doing that, they came up with a way of having some common records so that all those organisations knew who was in the city, where they were, what they needed. They had warm handovers from different services and thought about, actually, it makes sense for you to get your housing sorted out before you start thinking about your education or work or volunteering, because it's that prime need to have somewhere safe and warm and dry to live. They thought about sequencing and pathways and ways in. And perhaps really importantly, they thought about the gaps and the overlaps between services. And so by working together and having warm handovers and thinking about sequencing, they could say, actually, there's this need here that isn't being met. Can we come together and find the capacity to meet that need? And so in that partnership, you've got the local authority, you've got a number of voluntary sector organisations, you've got national and local voluntary sector organisations, and they're working really effectively so that there are fewer gaps, there's less overlap. People know who is there, who are the clients they're working with. There's warm handovers. And the support for refugees and asylum seekers is significantly enhanced. Now, I think one of the key things that project working was around capacity. It was about space to think about how can we share records, how can we share information, how can we have space even for a weekly meeting to come together and talk about who we're working with, what their needs are and what's there. But that's really important and it works. It's ongoing. The other example I talk about is the Voluntary Sector Emergencies Partnership. That's a national bringing together of 300 local, regional, national organisations. And it's very much about making friends before you need them, is the slogan. And it grew from the Grenfell tragedy again, and that's needs to better join up services and support on the ground. And it was really enhanced through the pandemic in how the voluntary sector came together and liaised better with statutory sector through the pandemic. It works with the Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government, works with the Cabinet Office on developing a whole society approach to resilience. And by bringing together, it has a monthly network meeting, which brings in emergency planners, the Environment Agency, local authorities, as well as a network of voluntary sector organisations. It really connects into a network of networks to join people together. And you know, remember a couple of years ago in Plymouth, there was an unexploded bomb found from the Second World War, 500 kilograms of explosives. And there had about 10,000 people had to be moved and evacuated in about 4 hours. Now, for one agency to do that is nigh on impossible. But because those people had already made connections and relationships through the Emergencies Partnership and recognised the skills of the voluntary sector, the skills of the police, the skills of the Local Resilience Forum, that was a massive success in terms of coordination, sharing of information, liaison, thinking about the needs of rest centres for foods and blankets, as well as getting people out of their house. And perhaps a really small example I'd give is thinking about who is the best people to do something, what are the skills, where's the trust and the relationships and the experience. Is if someone comes knocking on your door at 10 o'clock in the morning and says, right, you've got to get out now, there's an unexploded bomb down the road, are you more likely to do that if it's somebody who looks and talks and sounds like you, who you know from the community centre, than if it's a police officer in a police uniform that you might have quite a deep distrust of or not believe and stay where you are. So something about this trust and the connections and so on and how that happens, and working together, identifying where people are, how they can best evacuated, where they can be evacuated to a place of safety, and how their needs are met through people from their community is a really effective way of doing it. So I've talked about why collaboration matters, what is needed, but let me come back to that provocation just briefly about how the voluntary sector can work in collaboration to achieve renewal and system change, and what do we need to do so people can thrive and have the joy and the fun as well as the system change. And it seems to me that going to communities and seeking to understand where they are, that's by being leaders that bring curiosity and humility and will share power, is a much better way of getting there. Something for me about the university and academics thinking really critically about how we develop those attributes in other people and how we recognise and reward those attributes in our leaders so that we really get to that place of fostering them more widely across the voluntary sector, but also across the statutory and other sectors. So I guess my ask for you all here today is to think about what collaborative leadership means to me, to my role, and how can I understand others, bring in their perspective, their skills, their experience, and how can I leave my own interests at the door to do that? But I really believe that through collaboration, we can achieve better outcomes. Going back to the point of, do you want to go fast or do you want to go far? I think I want to go far. I want to do it together rather than apart. And I want to make sure that we've got the fun and the joy and that we bring hope to communities, as well as addressing those really systemic issues. Thank you.
Thank you, Maddy. At one stage, you lost your camera, so we couldn't see you. Oh,
I'm sorry.
Yes. Yeah, no,
apologies for that. Sorry.
Yeah, when the phone rang.
Oh no! And sorry for the phone interruptions as well.
I know. So we have 4 minutes. I have not seen questions from the virtual room. I don't know if there is anybody in here who would like to ask a question to Maddy. Yeah. Oh yeah. Okay. So Adam.
On.
Yes, it's on.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, it's not a question as such. I think it's an observation. Maddy referred to the changes in local authorities, districts becoming unitaries and all that. I think these changes are inevitable, and it's more about how we can adjust ourselves. But along that process, I think we are losing the council that is providing those services. It's like having those libraries that are closing. Somewhere people can go and feel that, yes, this is my place, this is my space. And as those changes are happening, councils are becoming more of budgets and resources, more of profit-making organizations, or not really making profits, but more conscious about their spending and all that. So the voluntary sector, I think, is having to adjust and fill that gap where people can relate and say, this is where we need to be. And by having that comfortable place, not comfortable as in luxurious and all that, but more about a place where you feel that you are grounded. And having that space, I think it's where communities can actually make those adjustments and contribute towards anything that is needed in our communities. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, it was rather a comment, but Maddy, if you have something to say, yes, go ahead. And you are on now, we can see you.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's a number of things at play. One is the cuts to local authority budgets, which are happening, including in councils that aren't being restructured. I think in councils that are being restructured, there's that pull of decisions further away from communities, from district councils into unitary. And like you say, the libraries and safe spaces, if you like, could be lost. I think while that change is happening, inevitably, council officials will be looking internally at their systems and structures and how they work. And there's a risk that relationships with the voluntary sector are lost, and that the community groups pick up that need that people have for somewhere to go, to connect, to be engaged. And I think it does put more onus on the voluntary sector to work together to do that, yeah.
And no further comments. I think it is actually time spot on. Just I do a few thank yous